I welcome you all to this program. I welcome, apart from the dignitaries of the dais, there are other dignitaries who have also arrived today to hear Dr. Scott. Prominent among them is Professor Sukhdev Thorat, who is amongst us, Dr. Puran Meshram, Dr. Kamble, Dr. Khandekar sir, as well as other dignitaries from various departments of the universities, students. I welcome you all once again. Before starting the program, I request the dignitaries as well as the audience to kindly arise for the university stand.
Well, thank you for attending this lecture, and Jai Bhim. Before I start, I'd like to thank Dr. Nitin Raut, who I had the pleasure of meeting at the airport as he was whisked away yesterday on important business, but I had a chance to thank him for endowing this lecture series. It's very important that we talk about Buddhism, Dr. Ambedkar, and related matters, because the minute we stop talking about this stuff, we stop thinking about these topics. And the minute we stop thinking about these topics, they don't truly matter to us. So it's important to have these forums, and I'm so pleased that I can be part of the legacy Dr. Raut has started in this lecture series. I'd also like to thank Dr. Kane and Deshpande for supporting the activities of this center and of this lecture series, and Dr. Niraj Bodhi for inviting me and shepherding me around the wonderful streets of Nagpur. So my topic is on Dr. Ambedkar and Buddhism, and this word you may or may not have heard before, pragmatism. I'm currently writing a book, the most intensive study, I believe, on the relationship of Dr. Ambedkar to one of his teachers, John Dewey. And I think there's a great story to be told here. There's a great story involving India, America, and democracy. And it has historical importance, and it also has contemporary importance. And today and tomorrow, I will inflect this story of pragmatism in India with the idea of Buddhism. Because I think it's incomplete to talk about Dr. Ambedkar without mentioning pragmatism. And I think it's incomplete to talk about his pragmatism if you don't talk about his Buddhism. Because his Buddhism is the form his pragmatism took at the end of his life. So, here are the questions that are going to orient my lecture today. We're going to revolve around these, and we're going to ask some questions about what the nature of social democracy is. Maybe you've heard of this before, but what is it? Where does Dr. Ambedkar get this topic from? Where does he get the parameters of his idea of democracy, and what does he do with it? Second, why is Ambedkar's Buddhism so unique, so creative, and in some cases so controversial? And then third, what does American pragmatism and thinkers like John Dewey have to do with this story of Dr. Ambedkar's Buddhism? Now, this has been a quest that's animated me since 2014. Like many of us, I started writing this book because I had an idea that it was important, and I should have been doing something else. And so I was procrastinating. But it turned out this is the most meaningful project I've ever engaged in. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to my Ambedkarite Buddhist friends. Perhaps by the end of today, it'll also mean something to you if it doesn't already. But it's been very meaningful, and it's dragged me to India about 6 or 7 times, looking for every scrap of paper Baba Sahib has written on, for every book he has annotated, for every notebook he has left in surviving condition. Anything that it takes to get into his mind to figure out how his education affected and led to those published works we see on our shelves in the wonderful blue volumes. So I've been to Mumbai, Nagpur, Pune, Kalyan, anywhere that I could find resources that aren't there in the published works. It's led me to meet a variety of important and interesting people, many associated with Dr. Ambedkar's legacy in Maharashtra. I was lucky to add the picture to this collection of meeting Dr. Raut yesterday. So it's a wonderful story, and in some ways I wish this book would never end, but I have a feeling I'll keep writing on Ambedkar after I'm done with the book on John Dewey and Bhimrao Ambedkar. But let's get back to those questions. Why was Dr. Ambedkar's form of Buddhism so powerful, so creative? Obviously, a lot of it had to do with his own imagination. I mean, he was an imaginative, powerful individual. But he was a very educated individual as well, right? And we should never forget that his education mattered to him. His books mattered to him. I've looked through every surviving book I could find of his. It's Siddharth College, Milind College, Symbiosis Institute, Rajgraha, private collections. Every book that was touched by Baba Sahib, I've hopefully handled and looked through, looking at every mark he left. And he loved his books, and there were so many topics covered. It's impressive. It's actually very humbling. I like to think I'm well-read, but not as well-read as him. So how could that mind have formed without some acknowledgement of the education behind it? So in the next 45 minutes or so, this is going to be the trick I'll try to play. I'll try to explain the wonder and originality of Baba Sahib in reference to some people who came before him, namely John Dewey, one of his teachers. Now, as you may know, his Buddhism, Dr. Ambedkar's Buddhism, was not always kindly received. In 1959, one of the first reviews of the Buddha and his Dhamma, a 1957 book, came out. And in this 59 Mahabodhi Journal Review, it was harshly criticized. They said it should be called Ambedkar and his Dhamma, not the Buddha and his Dhamma, because it's just for political ambition, sneers the reviewer. Now, I think this reviewer was missing something important to the puzzle. And as I'll try to explain to you and sell to you today and tomorrow, that part of the puzzle is that Ambedkar was deeply and sustainably influenced by pragmatist philosophy. He did interesting things that went far beyond what John Dewey thought, but if you want to understand why the Buddhists reacted in this way, you have to look at Bhimrao Ambedkar not as a postmodernist, not as a hermeneut, but look at him as a pragmatist, someone who wanted to use the past resources to better future experience. That applied to Buddhism as well. So let's get back to our questions. What is the nature of social democracy? Why is Dr. Ambedkar's form of Buddhism so unique? And then what does this story have to do with pragmatism at all? Now, we all know, most likely, that Ambedkar was well educated, and his first experience of foreign education started at Columbia University in June of 1913 when he got off a boat in Manhattan, New York, and started attending the summer session at Columbia University. Now, he took so many classes there, just like his libraries, with all the books, all the topics. You can look at his transcripts and see all the different courses he took, from railway economics to the history of economic thought to philosophy courses. Now, Columbia was influential for two main reasons. One was social. I won't belabor this, but it must be stated. Even with all its racial problems, New York of 1913 was comparatively free for a Dalit like Ambedkar. So he could dine with whoever he wants, he could touch water and touch drinking implements with abandon. He didn't have to worry about the same caste-based strictures as he did in India. So this surely left a mark on young Ambedkar. The thing I will emphasize more over the course of this talk is the second important reason why Columbia was so important. It was intellectually stimulating. Columbia at the time had one of the best collections of faculty that were progressively oriented. They wanted to change the fields they were in, or in some cases, these were even new fields like sociology. So Ambedkar stumbled into a university where novelty and creativity was the norm. And he also stumbled in to 3 classes taught by the leading philosopher of his day, John Dewey. And I would say today, the top philosopher still in the American tradition. So again, it's interesting to pause for a moment and think, what would be different about India if Ambedkar had done like every other educated or soon-to-be educated Indian and went to Oxford or Cambridge? It means something special that Ambedkar went to America, and something special that he ended up in the classrooms of John Dewey. Now, why Dewey? Well, in 1952, he leaves one of those rare moments of insight into his thinking process when he writes Savita Ambedkar from New York after he got word that John Dewey had died on the plane trip over. And Dewey died just about 3 days before Ambedkar arrived to receive his honorary doctorate at Columbia University. And he tells his wife, this is such a shame. I was looking forward to meeting Professor Dewey. Quote, I owe all my intellectual life to him. Now, Ambedkar was honest if he was nothing else. So this is surely not just flattery. He didn't need to say this in a private letter to his wife. So this means something. And I take this as a real clue that it tells you to do more work and find a deeper story. So up to now, we've had a variety of great scholars illuminate various parts of the Ambedkar story. And most of them mention Dewey, and most of them mention this letter. They also mention that Ambedkar told his wife that he could imitate Dewey should Dewey have died, all of his lectures. So even in his body, he thought he could imitate John Dewey. So everyone notes these facts, but I've always said, how specifically did Dewey influence Ambedkar? How specifically did Dewey's pragmatism, which had nothing to do with religion largely, turn into this wonderful new thing of Navayana Buddhism? So that's the project of my book. Telling the story of pragmatism in India means telling the story of how specifically Dewey and Ambedkar go together. Now you may be asking, who was John Dewey? I find myself often when I talk on this project in the United States, I have to inform my American colleagues who Dr. Ambedkar was. They know who Dewey was. In some ways, India is the opposite. Most Indians have a passing knowledge of Baba Sahib, and they don't know much about John Dewey. So this is, I'll spend a second or two introducing John Dewey. John Dewey, like I said, was the leading philosopher of his day. He's very well known for education. If you know anything about education and learning by doing or experiential learning, that comes from John Dewey largely. John Dewey initiated a variety of revolutions in educational thought, such that he got away from people, well, doing like I'm doing now, simply lecturing. Lecturing is useful, you see, but not all of education needs to be like that. So Dewey was a big proponent of experiential learning. He's also part of a movement in America that started with the Civil War. Charles Saunders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey are some of the most important pragmatists in the American tradition. Other pragmatist figures include Jane Addams. So there's this line of thinking that starts in the American context, and that's what I refer to today when I refer to pragmatism in general. Now, pragmatism, I think, has something to give India. So that's why I just came from Pune, where myself and Professor Dr. Vijay Khare started at Pune University the first center for John Dewey studies in all of India. I've always thought it a shame. China has about 5 Dewey centers, and it's not a democracy. But yet India, the largest democracy in the world, whose constitution was orchestrated by a student of John Dewey, doesn't have any organized units to promulgate the thought of John Dewey. So Vijay and myself struck a blow at this. I got American academics to donate all 38 volumes of Dewey's collected works, 100 kilograms. I know this because I carried them all in my luggage over here to make sure they safely arrived. And I hope to start more centers formed around the core of John Dewey's collected works. It's important that every one of our students, every one of our researchers has access to all the works of Baba Sahib and all the works of John Dewey, because I firmly believe you cannot understand the full implications of Ambedkar's Buddhism without understanding his relationship to Dewey, and I firmly believe that you cannot understand the weaknesses or strengths of Dewey's pragmatism without understanding what Ambedkar did with it in the Indian context. So, who is John Dewey? Back to this question. If you know anything about philosophy, you know of names like Hegel, a very confusing German philosopher. Dewey was animated by Hegel. So was Marx. Dewey was also influenced by Charles Darwin, the author of The Origin of Species and the Theory of Evolution. As a matter of fact, Dewey, I always remember his birth year because he was born in 1859, the same year Darwin's Origin of Species was published. So if you need a quick and ready guide to Dewey, think of Dewey as merging the focus on organisms and living creatures that's there in Darwin, along with the master-slave dialectic or dialectical reasoning in Hegel. So Dewey is this interesting mix in America of someone who respects science and someone who, sorry, I've been slacking on this, he combines the idealism of Hegel with the organicism of Charles Darwin. Now, in a more schematic fashion, Dewey's philosophy can be broken down into 4 kind of themes. Now, Dewey wrote 8 million words, right? 100 kilograms worth of knowledge. So he changed over time, but he was always interested in experience. And experience is plural. There's not just one way to experience things. India is the land of many darshans, many different ways of cutting up experience and religion and enlightenment and salvation. So India in some ways knows this better than cultures that just focus on science as having all the simple answers. So experience is plural, experience matters. 2, science also matters. Dewey, caring about Charles Darwin, cared about science. Yet science was a tool. Don't fall in love with its theories as if they reveal the metaphysical truth of the world. What scientific theory hasn't changed over the course of 20 years, Dewey would ask. So science is a tool. Theories are tools. Concepts are tools. If they stop providing useful value to you, move on. Revise them or abandon them. Change Newton for Einstein, Einstein for quantum theory. Community is also important. The pragmatists were big on community. Democracy is merely another word for the kind of political community you hope you can coalesce in a political system. Science was not a solitary endeavor. It involved a community of inquirers. And lastly, pluralism. The pragmatists were some of the most accepting philosophers you can find. That's why I think it is vitally important that Ambedkar went into Dewey's class, because Dewey wasn't concerned in his classroom with figuring out the right theory. He was concerned with figuring out the strengths and weaknesses of a variety of philosophical outlooks, darshans as we'd call them in the Indian tradition. So these kind of things lead Dewey to a variety of interesting theories on education and on politics. So for instance, take a part of Dewey that I find very important for the United States and very important for India. You all are going through some of the same challenges with democracy and how we get along with people that are different from us or people that disagree with us that America is going through. So Dewey asked early in his career, what is the nature of democracy? And his answer is interesting. He says, is it merely a decision-making procedure? Is it merely a way of counting votes, of deciding what to do, and then banging the gavel and you're done? Sometimes in America we think, be a good citizen, and that just means vote every 4 years for president. Here in India, you'll have a certain color on your thumb. So is that the exhaustive meaning of democracy? Dewey, very early on in his life, said no. He said no as early as 1888 in a wonderful essay called The Ethics of Democracy. I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. This essay Ambedkar had as early as 1936, and he requests it from a Dalit student in 1954. I'll talk a little bit about this and why we know this tomorrow. But he loved this essay, and it was from early in Dewey's career. And early in Dewey's career, when he was a young guy with a bright mustache, he said, democracy is a form of government only because it is a form of moral and spiritual association. Notice he's not talking about democracy means a certain kind of constitution. That's political democracy. But social democracy is a way of life. In 1916, in a book that was incredibly important to Baba Sahib, Democracy in Education, John Dewey puts it in these words, and those underlinings are what Baba Sahib left in the book. This is a very famous quotation. You'll find it on the back of many of the Writings and Speeches editions. Here, John Dewey says a democracy is more than a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. Notice there's nothing in there about separation of powers, checks and balances, presidents or prime ministers. John Dewey's talking about democracy at the everyday level, how you and I talk to our neighbors, how you and I talk to our bosses, how you and I talk to others on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. He's talking about democracy as a habit. Now, I'm going to talk about John Dewey's philosophy and how Ambedkar took key parts of it and did something wonderful and unique with it. But never fall so far in love with any description of Dewey or Ambedkar to think that they're not incredibly complex thinkers. So again, Dewey's thought spans over 8 million words, and it changes. It changes from 1888 to 1952 in his last writings. So always beware of someone who says pragmatism means one thing. So this is one thing I have set myself as a challenge. If I say Ambedkar was influenced by John Dewey, what part of Dewey? Ambedkar did not read all of these books. Okay, I have not even read all of these books or articles that are collected in his collected works. So what specifically did he have access to? What specifically animated him? What specifically did he disagree with in Dewey? This will be one of the challenges I tackle when I expand on his pragmatist form of Buddhism. Now let's take a sidestep here. Dewey made a huge mistake about 1919 to 1921. I call it Dewey's Indian mistake. Dewey almost came here to India. You see, the year after Ambedkar left the shores of America and went to London for further education, another student showed up in Dewey's class in 1917. Who's sure He was a Chinese young student coming on the Boxer Indemnity Funds. And he was in Dewey's class, and he loved Dewey's thought. He loved Dewey's thought so much, he took pragmatism back to China, and he wrote many books on pragmatism, connected it to the Chinese tradition, and he eventually, in 1919, invited Dewey over when Dewey was visiting Japan to give what turned out to be a series of 100 to 200 lectures, spanning 2 years in China. So Dewey took China by storm. Even though no one in the Chinese audience could understand a lick of English, Dewey would say something, and Husserl would translate it, and then student note takers in the front row would write it down, and it would get published in an hour or two in the Chinese newspapers. The Chinese knew Dewey as Mr. Democracy, Mr. Science. So Dewey went to China, and he took it by storm. One of those note takers in the front row, by the way, in 1920 was Mao. Okay, so when the communists win in China, they launch over 3 million words refuting the pragmatists like Husserl. So I've always found it ironic that we need to study more Dewey here, instead of so because India is a democracy in good and bad ways, like the U.S., and it's wrestling with the problems of democracy. So Dewey, I think, has something to tell us about this. Now, he almost went to India, you see. Before he left to go to Japan and then eventually to China, one of his friends, the art collector, Albert Barnes, who still has a wonderful collection of art remaining in Philadelphia, he knew all the Impressionists before they were big. Albert Barnes writes to Dewey and says this flattering line, "I learned with regret that you were not going to include China and India in the itinerary, your Japan trip. There is more really fine art in India than all the rest of the world put together." So Dewey's response, which I found among his correspondence, is simple. He says, "Okay, let's go." He's sold. So he writes his daughter, and he says, "Well, I'm going to go to Japan, then China, then India, etc." He's very ambitious. This is after he's just about to set off to Japan. And in a letter from Japan in 1919, he's excited about Japan because he sees a different, long-rooted form of tradition in the present. And he says, you don't even need to go to China and India to see antiquity. Dewey is starting to get what we call homesick. Now his 1-year trip to China after Japan turned into 2 years, and eventually you find this letter in February of 1920 before Dewey ends up heading home. He says, writing back to his family back at home, "I think personally I've got about all I can in China from my stay here now. I'd rather come back and go home later, another time from China via Russia or India." So you see, he starts to get homesick. He leaves in 1921 and comes home without seeing India, and he would never return to India. So this makes me, a person who's paid to think in a university setting, think some interesting thoughts. What would Dewey's philosophy have been? What differences would it have if he had seen India? China made a huge impact on him because of the close conditions of everyone knowing what everyone else is doing. But surely he would have seen that on the streets of Mumbai. He also would have seen religion on the faces of many Indians. He would have seen the caste system and spirituality, the good and the bad things in everyday life. So I think his book, Like a Common Faith, which comes out in 1934 on religion, would have been radically different if he would have seen India. And it's a crying shame he did not experience India. But nonetheless, what he did experience of India was in his classroom in 1913. He saw Bhimrao Ambedkar stumble in as a student among his other students. Now, I've never found any correspondence between Dewey and Ambedkar, either way. I don't think it exists. I think Ambedkar's relationship with Dewey was one of distanced admiration. It was an intellectual relationship in the finest sense. It wasn't like someone you take to coffee, or you take to eat, or you tell jokes with. It's someone who deeply inspires you by the power of their ideas. So the question I want to now ask is simple. How did this relationship unfold? How did John Dewey influence Bhimrao Ambedkar, and what did Bhimrao Ambedkar take from John Dewey's philosophy as he heard it? And this is going to add up to an Indian form of pragmatism that we could add to those stories people tell about China and pragmatism, and it's going to be a story we can add to the stories we tell about Buddhism and its development. Now at Columbia, I've been able to ascertain Dewey taught 3 classes that Ambedkar sat in. You look at Ambedkar's transcripts, for instance, at the University of Mumbai Karmode collection, and you see a huge list of courses. 5 of those are philosophy. 3 of those were taught by John Dewey. 2 of them were taught by a philosophical opponent of John Dewey, who never shows up as making a mark on Baba Sahib. The three classes that Ambedkar took were these: psychology or philosophy 231, psychological ethics; philosophy 131 to 132, a whole year segment of courses that focused on moral and political philosophy. So he took 3 semesters worth of courses. And you'll see in a second, there's demonstrable evidence these had an outsized impact compared to other classes, like railway economics or other classes that Ambedkar took. There's no evidence, by the way, that Ambedkar took anything that Dewey was teaching at Columbia on education. The best I can figure out, and you'll see this in a second, is that Ambedkar was exposed to Dewey's book on education, Democracy in Education, in 1917 in London. How do we know this? Because the student Ambedkar had enough time to sign the book, January 6, 1917, London. Okay? Later on in his life, Baba Sahib was so busy he had a stamp. He'd just stamp his name in books or not even sign them. But early on, he was careful enough to sign New York, Columbia University, 1913, etc. So now let's boil down this story into 4 concepts. I will talk about the 4th one in a lot of detail tomorrow. But today I want to set the groundwork for that, because I don't think you could understand what Baba Sahib does with Buddhism in the 1950s unless you understand concepts such as force, concepts such as caste as a mindset or as a habit, or the idea of social democracy. Now let's start with the first one, force and reform. In 1918, when right after he returns from London, when the Gaikwad of Baroda calls him back to service, Ambedkar publishes his first article, a book review of Bertrand Russell, a philosopher from England who was a philosophical opponent of John Dewey. It was an interesting relationship between Russell and Dewey. They both were lecturing in China at the same time, by the way. Dewey hated Russell's treatment of pragmatism. Russell thought pragmatism was all about might makes right. If you had enough strength, you could say what truth is. That's a very bad reading of pragmatism. But nonetheless, Russell had this. And so Dewey didn't want to respect Russell enough to attend the popular lectures by Russell in China. But Dewey wanted to know what he was saying so badly, he stood outside the doors at the back of the lecture hall so he could secretly listen to what the Brit was saying. So it's interesting and meaningful that Baba Sahib, a dedicated student of John Dewey, takes on as his first challenge a fairly critical book review of Bertrand Russell and his book on social reconstruction. Now, what does he say in this book? Bertrand Russell's book is very interesting. It comes out in 1916. It's republished in 1917 in America with a different title, Why Men Fight. So that gives you an idea. It's about the violence that was happening associated with World War I, and societies and leaders like Woodrow Wilson thinking that some of these things could be solved, some of the world's problems could be solved through the application of extreme force, up to and including violence. So Russell in this book, Russell, if you know about Russell, he's a pacifist. He was very much opposed to any use of military force, including in times when it led him to protest and get thrown into jail. But Russell, was very skeptical on the use of force to solve what you thought was oppression. So for instance, in Russell's book, Russell, says this. He says, claims are advanced on each side of a conflict, and they're always tethered to justice. We need justice. You're oppressing me. And each side honestly believes that it deserves to triumph. And then they fight it out. And then the last line here in red, when the oppressed win freedom, they are often just as oppressive as those who oppress them. So this is something I think the young Ambedkar surely took to heart. I mean, think about it. Someone's oppressing you. What do? One approach is find the way to take away their power or to take away their ability to oppress you. And in some cases, that means harming them in idea or in physical form. And you might even just become just as oppressive as they. You definitely, from their point of view, you'll be perceived as oppressive, whether they're right or you're wrong or vice versa. So this is what Russell's wrestling with, and the young Ambedkar sees this, and it strikes him as something very prescient, something very important. Yet he also worries that this is going to disable his Indian audiences. He publishes this review in a journal of Indian economics. So what does he say in this review? He, in this first publication, issues forth his first reference to Professor Dewey, as he says, and he uses the language of Professor Dewey to talk about passivity, quietism, non-resistance. These would be key terms, non-resistance at least, in Gandhi's Satyagraha efforts that start up in 1919 and beyond. So notice that what Ambedkar is worried about, our Indian audience is reading Bertrand Russell's book and stopping the fight against justice and injustice.